He was shoved out of the seat at the head of the table, right in front of everyone. "That seat is my father's. You have no right to sit there." Michael Rowan did not argue. He did not ask questions. He stood up, pulled on his coat, stepped out of the house, still warm with the smell of food, and let the door close behind him like a final period. Outside, the early autumn wind lashed his face. That night, a man lost his seat. By the next morning, he would realize he was on the verge of losing his name as well. The gathering had been planned for the holiday. Elaine had been awake since early morning cooking, as if organizing every detail, neatly enough might persuade life to behave. The roasted chicken carried the scent of herbs. The rolls were slightly overbaked at the edges, the dining table polished until it reflected the yellow light. Everything looked like a perfect family, if no one stared too long. Michael was the host, not on paper, but by habit. For more than 30 years, he had been the one who paid bills on time, fixed leaking pipes, and stood firm whenever something went wrong. To him, sitting at the head of the table was not a privilege. It was responsibility. The host was the one who kept the room from collapsing. Tyler arrived late as always. 33 years old, broad-shouldered eyes stretched tight like a cord pulled too far. Behind him came Raymond Tyler's biological father, a man who entered a room as if the room had been waiting for him all along. His voice was loud, his smile confident, his stance possessive. Elaine had said Raymond had been mostly absent during Tyler's childhood, but lately he had been showing up again, and every appearance carried the same sense of intrusion. Conversation skimmed across the table. A joke landed and died. Silverware clinked. Michael poured coffee for Elaine, black and strong the way she liked it, then pulled out his chair and sat where he always did. That was when Tyler placed his hand on the back of the chair. "Hold on." Michael looked up. "What is it?" Tyler tilted his chin toward Raymond as if presenting final evidence. "That seat is my father's," he said clearly without hesitation. "You have no right to sit there." The room froze. No one laughed. No one spoke. The old wall clock that had belonged to Michael's father kept ticking steady and indifferent. Michael waited. He waited for Elaine to say his name. She did not. She lowered her eyes and reached for napkins, focusing on the tabletop, as if the grain of the wood suddenly required more care than he did. Then Tyler shoved him. Not a half-hearted push, but 2 hands straight to the chest. The chair scraped backward. Michael's heel caught the rug, and the floor rushed up. Pain tore along his side and knocked the breath from him. The taste of metal rose in his mouth. Someone gasped. Someone said, "Hey." Raymond did not move. Tyler stood over him, chest heaving like he had finally said something he had been carrying for a long time. In that moment, something inside Michael went quiet. Not anger. Anger burns. This was colder, settled final. He pushed himself up slowly, steadying his weight. His eyes passed over the room, over faces that would not meet his gaze, and stopped on Elaine. She still would not look at him. Michael nodded once as if accepting a sentence that did not need to be read aloud, and walked out. The first cold bit under his shoes as he crossed the porch. He sat in his truck, hands on the steering wheel, watching his breath fog the windshield. Through the window, he could see shapes moving inside. People leaning in heads, turning laughter, returning too quickly, as if sound alone could erase what had just happened. He drove without turning on the radio. He did not want a song lying to him about how a night like this was supposed to feel. He stopped at a gas station and stood under fluorescent lights, staring at his reflection in the darkened glass. A man judged small, pushed aside with a bruise already blooming beneath his shirt. His phone vibrated. Elaine. He let it ring. Tyler. Then Raymond. He did not answer, not out of spite, but because if he spoke, then he was not sure he would say anything worth saving. When Michael returned to the house that had been his before the marriage, he changed his shirt, pressed ice to his side, and sat in the quiet. There was no clock here, only the hum of the heater and his own breathing. A memory surfaced sharp and unwelcome. 2 years earlier, when a pipe had leaked, Tyler had laughed and said his mother needed a real man around. At the time, Michael had smiled, believing the remark was meant for him. The phone vibrated again. A message appeared. "You embarrassed my father. You are just a guest in this family." Michael stared at the screen until it dimmed, then turned the phone face down. He told himself it was only a chair, only a holiday moment. But he knew better. It was a sentence that had been waiting to be spoken aloud for years. He did not belong. The next morning, Michael stood at the sink, a mug cooling in his hands while outside garage doors lifted and engines started ordinary life moving on. His phone lit up with a stack of missed calls, 17 in all, and one unfamiliar number. His stomach tightened with a certainty he could not yet name. He did not know it then, but within hours his dignity would be pulled fully into the light, and this time it would not stop at a chair. The chair remained empty after Michael left, but no one dared to sit in it right away, not out of respect, but because the room had suddenly become too real. Elaine was the first to move. She stood up and gathered the crumpled napkins, her motions small and hurried, as if putting a few things back in order might somehow seal the crack that had just split the air. Her hands trembled slightly, and feeling it only made her grip the napkins tighter. She did not look toward the door. If she did, she was afraid she would not be able to turn away. Tyler stayed standing beside the chair, his chest rising and falling. In his mind, what had just happened was not violence, it was correction. For years he had believed the house was arranged the wrong way. A man without blood ties quietly occupying a place that should have belonged to his real father. Tyler told himself he had only said what everyone else was already thinking, just louder, just clearer. Raymond was different. He did not care about the chair. He watched the eyes around the table, the ones that slipped away, the ones that measured. He understood the room had just witnessed a boundary being crossed, and that gave him both satisfaction and caution. He pulled the chair out and sat where Michael had been, as if it had always been meant for him. When his back touched the seat, he exhaled comfortable. "Eat," Raymond said, his voice low and steady. "Do not let a small thing ruin dinner." No one answered. Silverware lifted, then settled again. The food cooled. The scent of herbs grew heavy in the air. Elaine sat down, her eyes fixed on her plate. In her mind, the image of Michael standing, nodding once, and walking away, replayed again and again. There had been no accusation, no anger, and that silence was what made it hard to breathe. Elaine knew this had not started tonight. It had begun with every silence before this one, every time she let Tyler speak in half-jokes and half-truths, every time she allowed Raymond to appear without asking questions. She had told herself things would be fine if no one made a scene. She had not imagined the cost of that false peace would be the look of a man erased from his own home. At the head of the table, Tyler began to eat fast and forceful, as if victory needed to be confirmed through motion. Yet the more he ate, the stranger, the emptiness felt. No one looked at him with the approval he expected. No smiles came, no praise followed. He had spoken loudly, but the room was quieter than ever. Raymond glanced at Tyler and saw that his son was still inexperienced, still unaware that real power does not need to knock someone down. Raymond said nothing. He believed a new order required time to settle, and in that order, Michael was just a detail that would soon be forgotten. None of them knew that while they tried to finish dinner, Michael was sitting alone in his car, not far away. He was not crying, and he was not angry. In his mind, old memories were being sorted slowly and precisely. The times Tyler shrugged when bills were mentioned, the way Raymond called him maintenance with a half-joking tone, the moments Elaine said, "Let it go," to keep the peace. Michael understood something clearly. That house had never truly been his. He had only been allowed to remain as long as he did not take up too much space. Tonight he had taken a place they no longer wished to offer. At the table, Elaine set her fork down. She could not swallow another bite. "I am tired," she said softly. No one stopped her. No one asked why. She walked into the kitchen and stood with her back to the dining room, both hands on the sink. She closed her eyes and drew a deep breath. In that moment, Elaine realized she had lost something very difficult to recover, not the marriage, but her own self-respect. Tyler watched his mother, then turned to Raymond. "I was right," he said, searching for confirmation. Raymond nodded. "You were," he replied. "Sometimes you have to speak plainly to put things back where they belong." Yet deep inside Raymond, a faint sensation passed through him. The sense that the man pushed out into the cold was not as weak as he appeared, that the silence he left behind was not surrender, but retreat. When the meal ended, the house felt unsettled in a different way, not because dishes remained unwashed, but because no one knew where to look without seeing what they had done. And while they struggled to restore a sense of normal, Michael had already started his engine and driven away from the porch light. None of them understood that from that moment on, the story had changed direction. The man they judged small had not lost his power. He had only stopped handing it to people who did not deserve it. Michael did not go home right away that night. He drove until the porch light disappeared from his rearview mirror, as if not seeing it anymore might slow the feeling of being erased. The road stretched ahead, dark and slick white lane lines sliding past in a steady rhythm, like a breath forced to stay calm. He did not turn on the radio. He did not want a stranger's voice telling him everything would be fine when something had clearly broken and could not return to its original shape. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, not shaking, not angry, just firm. In his mind, Tyler's words replayed again and again. "You are just a guest in this family." They were not spoken in the heat of the moment. They were a conclusion prepared long ago, waiting for the right moment to be said out loud. Tonight, in front of everyone, it had been delivered. Michael pulled into an empty lot near the river. The wind carried the smell of cold water and metal. He shut off the engine and sat in the darkness, letting the sharp pain along his left side spread, and then slowly fade. The physical pain bothered him less than something else rising quietly inside him. Awareness. He had always believed his silence was a form of patience, that not reacting to half-jokes and half-truths was how he kept the peace. Now he understood that to people like Tyler and Raymond, silence was permission. Permission to take another step. Permission to take another seat. The phone vibrated. Once, then again. Elaine. He watched the screen light up briefly and then go dark. Not because he no longer cared, but because he knew that if he answered, he would do what he had always done. Smooth things over, soften the edges, make everything easier for others, by swallowing the bitterness himself. Michael drove to his old house, the one in his name, long before any other family dinners existed. When he stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and light dust met him. No food, no voices, only a quiet that did not need to perform. He changed clothes, peeled off the shirt, damp with sweat and grime, and studied the bruise spreading along his ribs, deep purple, edged with pale yellow. A clear mark of what had happened, impossible to deny. He pressed an ice pack to it, sank into the old armchair, and closed his eyes. Another memory surfaced uninvited. 2 years earlier, when a kitchen pipe at Elaine's place had leaked, Michael had crouched to fix it late into the evening. Tyler had leaned in the doorway, laughing, saying his mother needed a real man in the house. Back then, Michael had smiled. He thought the remark was a clumsy challenge from a younger man. He had missed the truth in it. It was not a challenge. It was exclusion. The phone vibrated again. A message. Michael opened it and read each word slowly. "You embarrassed my father. You are just a guest." The screen dimmed in his hand. He turned the phone face down on the table, as if that might put the words a little farther away. He told himself it was only a dinner, a moment, an incident. But deep down, he knew he was lying. This was not about a chair. It was about how they looked at him when they thought he was not listening, not reacting, not doing anything. Michael stood and walked to the window. Outside, other houses were still lit. Other families were still laughing, arguing, living on. Life did not stop because one man was pushed away from a table, and that realization brought another truth with it. If he did not reset his own place, no one else would. Somewhere else in the house he had just left, Elaine sat on the bed with her phone in her hand, staring at a dark screen. She had called again and again. No answer. For the first time in years, she felt a hollow she did not know how to fill. She had believed silence was neutral. Now she understood silence was also a choice, and she had chosen wrong. Tyler sat in the living room tapping his fingers against his knee. The first rush of victory had faded, leaving a restless unease he could not name. He had said what he had wanted to say for a long time, yet instead of relief, the house felt larger, emptier, as if he had pushed out not just a man, but something that had been holding everything up. Michael returned to the armchair and opened the small drawer beside it. Inside were old papers, paid bills, things he had always kept in order. He did not know what he was looking for. Maybe a foothold, maybe proof to himself that he had never been just a guest. He sat back down, drew a deep breath, and let it out slowly. In that quiet, a thought formed clear and unclouded by emotion. If they believed he was weak because he was silent, they were completely wrong. His silence had never been a lack of power. It had only been power that had not yet needed to be used. The phone rang just as the sun cleared the roof of the house across the street. It was not Elaine. It was not Tyler. It was an unfamiliar number. Michael stood at the sink, the coffee in his hand already cold. Outside, the neighborhood woke the way it always did. Garage doors lifting, engines turning over, the ordinary sounds of a life, unaware that a boundary had just been erased. The phone rang again, firmer this time, as if it would not accept being ignored. Michael set the cup down, dried his hands, and answered. The voice on the other end was polite and rounded, professional, and without emotion. The woman introduced herself, confirmed his name, verified a few details, then said a sentence that drained the color from the kitchen. There was a personal line of credit opened under his name, with him listed as guarantor. 2 payments had been missed. The system had flagged it. Michael did not respond right away. His eyes went to the empty space on the wall where his father's clock had once hung. Then he asked calmly if there had been a mistake. The woman apologized for the inconvenience, but said the file was clear. His name, his signature, the date the account was opened. Everything looked correct. The shock did not arrive like an explosion. It rose slowly, like cold water creeping up the neck. Michael wrote down the address, ended the call, put on his jacket, and drove to the nearest branch. He did not panic. Panic is the privilege of people unused to responsibility. Michael had spent his life standing at the head of the circuit, where mistakes always carried a cost. The bank lobby was bright and cool, scented with new paper and weak coffee. The woman from the call greeted him with a professional smile, gestured for him to sit, and placed a thin folder on the desk. She opened it, turned it toward him, and pointed to a line that felt uncomfortably familiar. His name, a curved signature slightly slanted just like his. From a distance, it was perfect. Up close, it was not. Michael leaned in. The rhythm was slower where his was quick. A line lingered where his always ended clean. Small differences, but to a man who had signed his name thousands of times, unmistakable. "That is not my signature," he said. The woman did not argue. She nodded, opened a drawer, and set another document on the desk, a statement of unauthorized use. She explained the process in an even tone like a safety briefing. Signing it would trigger a fraud investigation. There could be legal consequences for whoever submitted the paperwork. Once started, it could not be undone. Michael leaned back and looked at the white ceiling. The pieces from the night before began to lock into place. The shove. Elaine's averted eyes. Tyler's words that he was just a guest, and further back, the bills slid toward him without discussion, the papers handed over with the same phrase, "Just sign it, so this is done." He did not decide in anger. He decided in clarity. His name was not something to borrow and return later. Michael took the pen and signed the statement. This time the ink moved fast and sure, without hesitation, like a clean cut. The ink had barely dried when his phone vibrated. Elaine. The woman across from him glanced at the screen and then away, giving him space. Michael let the call go unanswered. He stood, thanked her, and stepped outside. The cold air struck his face, and for the first time that morning he felt fully awake. In his car, he sat still. Then the phone vibrated again. Tyler. He did not answer. A message followed, rushed and unsteady, talking about a banking problem, saying the account had been frozen, insisting that if Michael just called to confirm, everything would be fine. Too fast. Michael understood. Too fast to be coincidence. It told him everything he needed to know. No accusation was required. No confrontation. The truth had walked into the light on its own. Michael drove home, opened the cabinet where he kept his documents. Deeds, insurance, paid receipts. He took out a blank notebook, set it on the table, and began to write. Dates, times, events. No emotion, no judgment. Just facts arranged carefully. Elsewhere, Elaine sat on the edge of the bed, phone in her hand, messages from Tyler stacking on the screen. She had never imagined it would go this far. She had believed she could borrow Michael's name for a moment, and everything would return to normal. She did not understand that some names cannot be borrowed. They can only be respected. And Tyler, for the first time in his life, felt the ground beneath him lose its certainty. He had grown used to others carrying the weight, used to silence meaning agreement. Now Michael's silence meant something else, not endurance, initiation. Michael closed the notebook and placed it beside the stack of papers. He sat down and drew a slow, steady breath. They could push him out of a chair, but they had touched something they should not have. From this moment on, the story was no longer about family. It was about the truth. Tyler's account was frozen before Michael had even put the notebook back into the drawer. The messages came in fast and frantic, as if someone had just pulled the plug on whatever had been keeping him afloat all this time. Michael read them and didn't reply. He sat still in the dim midday light, sunlight falling across the table where the papers were laid out in neat lines. Everything looked ordinary, almost deceptively so. But beneath that calm, a system had begun to move. Quietly, without warning, gears locking into place. Tyler called, then called again. The voice in the voicemail shifted quickly. At first it was irritated, edged with command. Then it turned anxious. Finally it became pleading, trying and failing to sound composed. He talked about a gas station, about cards being declined, about automatic payments bouncing back. He spoke as if it were a minor mistake, as if all it would take was Michael picking up the phone for everything to fall back into place. Michael listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not feel satisfaction either. That emotion arrived more slowly. What he felt instead was clarity. The silence that had once been mistaken for weakness had now become the thing that left others unable to stand. Elaine's name appeared in the call log soon after. She did not text, she only called. The calls were longer, slower, as if she were weighing every breath. Michael did not answer. Not to punish her, but because there are conversations that, if held too soon, only drag everything back into the same old cycle, smoothing things over, soothing feelings, placing the weight back on his shoulders. He stood, opened the back door, and stepped into the small yard. Wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of damp earth. Michael drew a deep breath. In that moment, memories surfaced. Tyler leaning against a wall, smirking when responsibility was mentioned. Raymond clapping him on the shoulder, calling him maintenance like a joke that did not need laughter. Elaine saying, "Let it go, just to keep the peace." Michael understood then that they had not been unaware. They had known. They had simply trusted that he would keep carrying it because he always had. The phone vibrated again. A short message stripped of patience. Tyler said this was going too far, that Michael did not need to do this, that this was family. Michael set the phone down, went back inside, opened the notebook, and wrote another line. Time, content, reaction, no commentary, no adjectives, only fact. Across town, Elaine sat on the edge of the bed, her hands tightly clasped. Tyler's messages stacked up on the screen. She had never believed it would unravel so quickly. In her mind, using Michael's name had always been temporary, a borrowed bridge to get through a hard stretch. She had believed his silence meant consent. Now that silence meant something else, and she did not know how to face it. Raymond stood in his kitchen phone, pressed to his ear, voice low but tense. He talked about loyalty, about how family should handle things internally. Even as he spoke, he felt control slipping. He had been used to defining others. This one was weak. That one could be managed. Michael, in his view, had always been someone who could be pushed aside. Now that assumption was pushing back. Michael closed the notebook, set the pen down, and sat quietly in his chair. He did not need to call the bank again. He did not need to explain. He did not need to demand anything. What he had done was enough to let the system work on its own. He had placed the truth where it belonged. Another call came from an unfamiliar number, this one calm, unhurried. Michael answered. The voice introduced itself as an investigator, explaining that the file was moving to the next stage. More time would be needed. More documents. Michael replied simply, clearly. He would cooperate. When the call ended, the house returned to its quiet. Michael stood, poured himself a glass of water, and watched the light spread across the floor. He didn't feel stronger. He felt straighter. Some people believe power is loud. Some believe it is force. Michael understood that real power is the ability to stop, to no longer shield others from the consequences of choices that were never yours. He was not taking revenge. He was simply no longer carrying the weight for them. Outside, the calls continued. Explanations, demands, accusations. Michael did not listen. He knew that from this moment on, nothing would return to the way it had been. And for the first time in a long while, he was not afraid of that. Brandon showed up at Michael's house that afternoon without warning. No call, no message. Just standing there, as if his presence alone were meant to explain everything. Michael noticed the car parked crooked along the curb through the living room window. He did not rush. He let the kettle cool, set the cup on the table, then walked to the door and opened it. Brandon stood close to the step shoulders, tight, his eyes no longer sharp the way they had been before. On his face was a strange mix of anger and fear, like a man who had just realized he had gone too far and did not know how to step back. "We need to talk," Brandon said immediately without greeting. "This has gone too far." Michael did not invite him in. He did not shut the door either. He stood where he was, close enough to hear, far enough not to be pulled in. "Go ahead," he said, calm. Brandon took a quick breath and began speaking fast, as if afraid that if he slowed down, the thin certainty holding him together would fall apart. He talked about accounts being frozen, about not being able to withdraw money, about calls from banks, from lenders, from places that had always assumed things would work themselves out. He said Michael did not need to do this. That one phone call would fix everything. Michael listened. He did not interrupt. He noticed something Brandon himself did not. In all that frantic talking, there was not a single apology, not one admission, only panic because the system was no longer protecting him. "This is family," Brandon said at last, his pace slowing. "We can handle this between us." Michael looked directly at him. "Family does not use someone else's name and call it a solution," he said. The words were not loud, but they fell between them with weight. Brandon stiffened. For a moment he was no longer the man who had shoved someone out of a chair. He was a man whose familiar armor had just been stripped away. "You always make things bigger than they need to be," Brandon shot back. "You know I did not mean any harm." Michael shook his head slightly. "You do not need bad intentions to cause damage," he said. "You only need to believe I will carry it for you." The door behind Brandon opened. Elaine stepped onto the porch. How long she had been standing there, Michael did not know. Her eyes were red, her hands clenched in the fabric of her sleeve, as if holding herself together. "Michael," she said, her voice rough. "Can we talk? Just us." Michael looked at her. For the first time since the night of the dinner, she did not look away. In her eyes was fear, regret, and a question she did not speak. He nodded, then looked back at Brandon. "You should go," he said. Not harsh, not threatening. Just a boundary reset. Brandon opened his mouth, as if to say something else, then stopped. He looked at Elaine, searching for the familiar rescue. It did not come. Elaine did not look at her son. She looked at Michael. Brandon turned away and walked down the steps faster than he had arrived. The car started and pulled off, leaving a heavy quiet behind. Elaine stood still for a long moment. "I did not think it would turn out like this," she said. "I thought it was temporary." Michael leaned against the doorframe. "You thought my silence meant agreement," he said without accusation. "It was trust. And trust is not something you use as a tool." Elaine lowered her head. Moments from before replayed in her mind the times she signed for him, the times she said let it go, the times she chose what was easy instead of what was right. "I was scared," she whispered. "I thought if I handled it quickly, no one would get hurt." Michael exhaled slowly. "Some pain comes from delay," he said. "It doesn't disappear. It just builds." After a while, Elaine left. No arguing, no promises. Just the heavy walk of someone who had realized she could not return to her old place. Michael closed the door, rested his forehead briefly against the cool wood, then turned back inside. He sat down, opened the notebook, and added a few lines. The meeting, the words, the reactions. No emotion, no interpretation. Just the truth recorded while it was still fresh. Somewhere in the system, those lines would matter more than any plea. Michael looked around the room, the same furniture. But the air was different, lighter, clearer. He understood that from this moment on, nothing would depend on whether he was willing to carry the weight. It would depend on where the truth stood. People often think power belongs to the one who speaks the loudest. Michael knew real power is the ability to remain still while others panic and not take back the truth just to preserve false peace. He had been underestimated because he was quiet, and that was why they had not seen what was rising in him now. The evidence did not surface in a courtroom. It came through an audio recording Michael never imagined he would have to hear. It arrived late in the afternoon when the sunlight had turned gold and the house was so quiet he could hear the wood settling in the cold. Michael sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open in front of him, rereading the lines he had written. No emotion, added no commentary, just truth placed where it belonged. His phone vibrated. A short message from someone he had not spoken to in a long time. Henry Cole, an old friend, a retired lawyer. The man who once taught Michael that if you do not record things while they are still warm, they will later be dismissed as unreliable memory. The message contained only one sentence. I think you need to hear this. Michael did not call back right away. He waited. Not out of suspicion, but because he had learned that urgency usually serves those who are afraid. When he finally answered, Henry's voice was low and steady without preamble. I am nearby. I have something you should hear in person. They met at a small coffee shop where the smell of roasted beans and the grind of machines swallowed private conversations. Henry looked older than the last time Michael had seen him, more gray in his hair, but his eyes were still sharp and awake. He set his phone on the table and turned the screen toward Michael. Listen, Henry said. Then decide. The recording began. Brandon's voice came first, laughing confident, talking about the loan, about using Michael's name. Then Raymond's voice followed, lower, firmer. He said it was fine, that Michael always signed, that Michael was maintenance used to carrying these things, that if he stayed quiet, everything would pass. Michael did not move. He did not flinch. He did not breathe harder. But inside his chest, something locked into place, final and absolute. This was no longer suspicion, no longer intuition. This was admission, clear and cold, that his name had been used as a tool and his decency treated as an endless resource. Henry stopped the recording. This, he said slowly, is intent. Not a mistake. Not family confusion. Deliberate. Michael nodded. He did not ask how Henry had obtained it. He did not need to know. What mattered was that it existed, and that it said what avoided glances and careful words never dared to say out loud. You do not need to make a spectacle, Henry continued, but you do need to let the system do its job, and you need to stop shielding them. Michael looked through the window. Outside, people passed by, talking, laughing, buying coffee to go. Life continued, unaware that he now held something capable of altering several lives. I do not want revenge, Michael said. I just want the truth to stand where it belongs. Henry nodded. Then you are already on the right path. Somewhere else, Elaine sat alone in the living room with the lights turned low. She had spoken to the bank's attorney and heard words she never imagined would be attached to her family. Fraud, legal responsibility, consequences. She covered her face, realizing that every time she signed for Michael, every time she chose silence was returning now, in a form she could no longer soften. Brandon sat in his car parked along the curb, hands clenched around the steering wheel. His phone kept vibrating, but he did not dare answer. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be seen by the system itself, without favoritism, without mercy. The name Michael, once a cushion he leaned on, had become a wall. Michael returned home after dark. He placed Henry's phone beside the notebook and added another line. Source of recording. Content. Time. No commentary. No interpretation. Just truth, given another layer of protection. He sat back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of the dinner, the chair, the shove. Then he thought of this. The real turning point was not the humiliation. It was that when they believed him weak, they had spoken the truth about themselves. Michael opened his eyes. The room was quiet, but no longer fragile. He understood that from this moment the story had moved to a different level. No longer family against family, no longer words against words. This was where truth found a voice, and he did not need to raise his own. He only needed to stand still and let it speak. The summons did not arrive with a knock on the door. It came in a thin envelope lying still on the doormat outside the house. Michael picked it up, the paper cold like metal in his hand, and knew that from this moment on, everything would step out of the familiar quiet. He set the envelope on the table and did not open it right away. The house was silent, gray morning light slipping through the curtains, revealing dust drifting in the air. Michael brewed coffee, his movements slow and precise, habits honed over years. When he finally opened the envelope, the printed words were clear and emotionless, requesting his presence for an official meeting with investigators. No threats, no explanations, just the next step. Michael did not feel afraid. He felt order. Elsewhere, Elaine read a similar document with hands that trembled slightly. She sat in the kitchen, the chair Michael once occupied now empty. Each line reminded her of decisions she had treated as small. She thought of the signatures of the dinner night, of the moment she did not say Michael's name when he fell. That silence had now become evidence against her. Brandon read his notice on his phone, the letters small but heavy. He no longer shouted. He no longer blamed. He simply sat with a new and uncomfortable sensation, responsibility that could not be pushed away. The meeting day came faster than Michael expected. The investigation office looked nothing like people imagined. No harsh lights, no raised voices. Just a modest room, a wooden table, straight chairs, and a recorder placed in the center. The investigator was a middle-aged man, voice even, eyes uninterested in drama. Michael told everything from the beginning. No additions, no omissions. He spoke of the dinner, the chair, the shove the bank called, the signature that was not his, the recording. As he spoke, he did not look down. He looked straight ahead, not in defiance, simply without hiding. The investigator took notes, nodding occasionally. When Michael placed the phone on the table and played the recording, the room grew even quieter. Brandon's voice, Raymond's voice, words that once sounded harmless now carried a different weight. When the recording ended, the investigator stopped the device and looked up. He asked if Michael understood where this could lead. Michael said he understood, and that he understood he could not control the outcome, only his decision to tell the truth. That was the moment the investigator studied him longer, not as a suspect, but as someone who had chosen not to step back. In the hallway outside, Elaine waited. She stood when she saw Michael. In her eyes was worry, but also something like relief. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Michael nodded to her. Not cold, not familiar. Just an acknowledgement that they were both facing the consequences of past choices. Brandon did not come. He communicated through a lawyer. That distance said more than any explanation. His former confidence was gone, leaving a hollow space no one could fill for him. Michael left the building in the late afternoon. The air outside felt cooler. He breathed deeply, feeling his chest expand. A clear thought formed. He had been underestimated because he did not compete, shout, or impose. And that was why they failed to see that he knew how to stand when the system began to move. That evening, Michael returned home, hung his coat, and sat down. He opened the notebook and wrote another line. Meeting date. Content. Observation. He paused on the last word, then crossed it out. No observation was needed. Only truth. Elsewhere, Elaine lay in bed, staring at the ceiling for the first time in years, not trying to explain herself away. Brandon sat in the darkness of a temporary room, phone silent beside him, realizing that some calls would never come to save him. Michael turned off the lights and stood by the window. Outside streetlights flickered on one by one. The world kept moving. He did not know how the end would look, but he knew this. From now on, he was no longer being dragged through someone else's story. He had planted his feet on the ground and stood there firmly, letting the truth find its own way forward. The hearing was scheduled for a morning when the city seemed to wake earlier than usual. Michael stood in front of the mirror, tightened his tie, and noticed that his hands were not shaking. He arrived at the courthouse before the appointed time. The hallway was long lit by white lights, carrying the mixed scent of paper and metal. Wooden benches were lined up neatly polished smooth by years of waiting hands. Michael sat down, placed the notebook on his lap, then closed it. Today he did not need to take notes. Today the truth would speak for itself. Elaine sat a few rows away. She came alone. No heavy makeup. Her eyes looked tired but clear. When she saw Michael, she gave a small nod. No pleading, no avoidance. Just a late acknowledgement that some things cannot be repaired with words. Brandon arrived with his lawyer. He wore a well-fitted suit, but his steps no longer carried confidence. His eyes passed over Michael, then dropped to the floor. Raymond came last, still trying to hold on to his old authority, but his movements were slower, as if the weight of the room no longer allowed him to brush things aside. When Michael's name was called, he stood, not rushed, not hesitant. His voice was steady as he answered the first questions. He laid out the sequence of events in order without emotion. The dinner, the chair, the shove, the call from the bank, the forged signature, the recording. Each detail landed like a stone, forming a path that could not be denied. Brandon's lawyer attempted to redirect, asking about family conflict, about hurt feelings, about whether Michael had overreacted. Michael listened, then answered briefly. He said he had feelings, but he was there because his identity had been used without consent. Those were not the same thing. The room went quiet. The judge nodded and took notes. When the recording was played, the atmosphere shifted. Brandon's familiar voice filled the room, casually cruel, as he said Michael would carry it. Raymond's voice followed, firm and certain, treating it as an obvious fact. No one laughed. No one whispered. Truth, when spoken in an official space, needs no decoration. Elaine lowered her head. Hearing the words again felt like listening to a sentence being read aloud for herself. She realized that in every effort to keep the surface calm, she had allowed the wrong to happen, and her silence was no longer harmless. Brandon went pale. For the first time, he looked at Michael for a long moment, not with challenge, not with contempt, with confusion. He had believed Michael was weak because Michael did not push back. Now he understood that the silence had been discipline, boundary strength, held in reserve. Raymond tried to speak, talking about family, about good intentions. The judge cut him off, saying intention does not erase action. The sentence was short, but it fell like a hammer. The hearing ended without dramatic gavel strikes. There were only next steps procedures that would continue, but everyone understood that a door had closed. Not a door of vengeance, but a door where hiding was no longer possible. Outside the courthouse, the sky was clear. Michael paused on the steps and took a deep breath. Elaine approached him. She said she was sorry, finally saying the words. Her voice did not ask for forgiveness, only to be heard. Michael looked at her and said he believed her, but belief does not erase consequences. It only helps people face them. Elaine nodded and walked away, slow but upright. Brandon stood at a distance, hesitated, then turned and followed his lawyer. Raymond did not look at Michael as he passed. Michael remained alone for a moment longer. He did not feel relief in the way stories often describe. No victory, no satisfaction, only a new stability like electricity restored properly after a long fault. He returned home, hung his coat, placed his keys on the table. The notebook was opened once more. He wrote one final line for that day, then closed it. Nothing more was needed. Night fell. Michael stood by the window, watching streetlights come on. He thought about the seat he had lost, and realized it had never been the center of the story. The center was the moment he chose not to sit in any place, that did not respect his name. In the quiet, Michael understood that real power does not need display. It lives in the ability to step into the light with the truth and walk back out without losing yourself. The preliminary conclusion arrived on a rainy evening while Michael stood in the living room listening to water tapping against the window. It was not an explosion, but the dry click of a lock signaling that the door behind them had closed. Michael read each line slowly. The legal language was dry and precise, leaving no room for emotion. Identity fraud, unauthorized use of a signature, personal liability. Words that had once felt distant now lay quietly on the page, bound to people he had once called family. He set the papers down and sat still, letting the truth settle like silt after a storm. In another house, Elaine read the same words with uneven breaths. She did not cry. Tears had been used up on earlier nights. What remained was a heavy emptiness where familiar justifications no longer worked. She replayed every time she had signed on his behalf, every moment she had told herself it was temporary, and finally understood that temporary choices, repeated long enough, become permanent. Brandon received the news in a rented room under weak yellow light. He read it again and again, as if the letters might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. Everything he had trusted to be smoothed over had collapsed. There was no one left to carry it for him, no name left to lean on. For the first time, he had to face consequences that could not be handed off. Raymond called his lawyer, his voice still trying to sound steady, but the confidence had cracked. He spoke of contributions of standing, of things that once made others hesitate. On the other end, the response was brief and cold. The law did not care who he knew, only what he had done. Michael did not call anyone. He did not need to. At this point, conversation was only an echo of choices already made. He cleared the table, stacked the papers neatly, then opened the notebook once more. He wrote the date, the conclusion, and one short line, noting that everything was moving in the direction of the truth. Then he closed the book. Nothing more was needed. A few days later, a meeting was arranged to address the civil consequences. The conference room was bright glass walls, a long table. Michael sat upright not to perform, but because he had nothing left to hide. Elaine sat across from him, hands folded, eyes steady at last. Brandon did not attend. His lawyer spoke for him. Raymond came quieter than before. Terms were read. Assets were reassessed. Privileges once sustained by silence were now examined under clear light. There were no loud arguments, no drama, only careful adjustments returning things to where they belonged. When it ended, Elaine lingered. She said she did not expect forgiveness, only wanted him to know she finally understood. Michael nodded. Understanding was the first step. He said living differently was the harder one. On the drive home, Michael stopped at a small gas station, bought a hot coffee, and stood under the awning listening to the rain. He thought about his life, about years of quiet work, about how people had grown used to him, always being there, always fixing, always carrying. They had never believed him weak. They had only grown comfortable with him, not asking. Back home, Michael hung his coat and turned on the light. The room looked the same, but the feeling had changed. The invisible pressure that once filled the corners was gone. He sat down, closed his eyes briefly, and let his body remember what it felt like to stand without bracing. Elsewhere, Elaine began sorting old papers without trying to cover anything up. Brandon stared into an uncertain future, with no one left to block the wind. Raymond faced the reality that power built on dismissing others always comes with an expiration date. Michael opened the window. The rain had softened cool air moving into the room. He knew this was not the end, but it was a turning point that could not be reversed. From the moment he stopped carrying what was never his, the world had been forced to correct itself. And in the quiet after the rain, Michael felt clearly what he had always possessed, but never named the power of a man who is no longer afraid of the truth. Michael woke before dawn, his heart racing, as if someone had called his name inside a dream. There was no ringing phone, no message waiting, only the clear sense that one chapter had ended, and the next no longer allowed him to turn back. He sat up slowly, letting his body catch up with his thoughts. Outside the window, darkness still covered the familiar street lights, casting pale yellow onto pavement damp from the night's rain. Michael stood pulled on a jacket and stepped onto the back porch. The cold air sharpened his focus. For the first time in weeks, he no longer felt pushed forward by events. He was moving by his own choice. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A short message from an unknown number. No apology, no threat. Just a cautious question, asking if they could talk. Michael looked at the screen for a few seconds, then turned the phone off. Not now. Some conversations only matter when the person asking is ready to hear an answer they will not like. The morning passed quietly. Michael brewed coffee, read a few pages from an old book, and reorganized the drawer where he had kept the documents that had followed him through the recent ordeal. He no longer needed them close at hand. They had done their work not to defeat anyone, but to place the truth where it belonged. Across town, Elaine also woke early. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. Everything around her looked familiar, but the old sense of safety was gone, not because Michael had left, but because the wall built from silence had collapsed. She thought about their years together, about how Michael had always been there, quietly fixing what broke in the house, and beyond it. She had once believed that constancy was automatic. Now she understood it had always been a choice. Brandon woke in a small room where traffic noise slipped through thin windows. He opened his phone and scrolled through denied notifications, reminders that no longer spoke politely. For the first time, he had to face his own decisions without another name standing in front of him. His old anger had faded, replaced by an emptiness he could not easily name. What frightened him most was not the loss of money, but the realization that his silence was no longer harmless. Raymond sat alone in his office, staring at a list of calls that were no longer returned as quickly as before. He had believed power could bend reality. Now reality stood upright without asking permission, and that made him smaller in ways he had never prepared for. In the afternoon, Michael drove to a small park near his home. He sat on a wooden bench watching children run and listening to wind move through bare branches. He thought about the chair at the dinner table years ago, about how one small act had set everything in motion. He realized the most important moment had not been when he was shoved, but when he stood up and walked away without asking anyone's permission. An old acquaintance recognized him, nodded, exchanged a few casual words. Michael answered briefly and smiled. No one could see the change inside him, and he did not need them to. Real transformation does not require an audience. As evening fell, Michael returned home. He cooked a simple dinner, cleaned up, and sat in his familiar chair. His phone vibrated again, the same unknown number. This time he opened the message. It held a single line saying they understood now and admitted they had been wrong. Michael did not reply immediately. He set the phone down and closed his eyes for a moment. He felt no triumph, no victory, only a quiet confirmation that what he had done had mattered. He picked up the phone and typed slowly, saying he hoped they would live differently from now on. He sent the message without adding anything else, without promises, without reopening old loops. Michael stood, turned off the lights, and looked outside one last time. Darkness settled over the street, but it no longer felt heavy. He understood that real strength does not come from making others afraid. It comes from the ability to move forward without dragging the past behind you. And in that stillness, Michael knew he was ready for the final chapter, not to close something, but to set down what had never truly belonged to him. One morning, as Michael rehung his father's old clock on the living room wall, the entire neighborhood suddenly lost power. The clock hands froze mid-movement, as if time itself was waiting to see whether he would continue or stop. Michael stood still, his hand resting on the worn wooden frame. He did not rush. He knew the clock did not measure power. It measured patience. Electricity would return. Time would move again. What mattered was how the man standing before it had changed. He stepped back and looked around the room. It was emptier than before, yet no longer cold. There was no sense of needing to guard himself, no need to shrink to avoid friction. It was simply an honest space, one that allowed him to breathe. Outside, life did not pause for his story. People still went to work, still argued, still loved, still repeated old mistakes, hoping this time would be different. Michael understood that. He did not expect the world to change because of him. He only needed the world to stop demanding his silence, so others could remain comfortable. Elaine moved the last boxes into her new apartment, working slowly and carefully, as if each item carried a reminder. There was no one standing behind her now to quietly fix poor decisions, and no one left to blame. In a rare moment of honesty with herself, she realized Michael had never taken anything from her. He had simply stopped giving. Brandon began a new job with low pay and long hours. No one knew who he was. No one cared about his last name. For the first time, he had to prove his worth through action instead of a borrowed identity. Some evenings he returned to his small room and stared at the blank wall, remembering Michael's calm expression in the courtroom. Not anger, not revenge. The look of a man who had decided he would no longer be used as a foundation. Brandon did not call it a lesson yet, but it had begun to settle deep inside him. Raymond quietly faded from conversations that once felt familiar. No more advice requested. No more respectful nods. He still existed, still lived, but no longer influenced the room. And for a man accustomed to standing above others, that absence of weight was the heaviest punishment of all. Michael reset the breaker. The lights came back on. The clock resumed its steady ticking, the sound spreading evenly through the room. He sat down and closed his eyes for a moment, not to revisit the past, but to feel the present. His body was no longer tense. His breathing was slow and deep. In that quiet, he understood a simple truth. He had never been weak. He had only chosen a form of strength that did not need noise. In the afternoon, Michael went for a walk. The same familiar street, the same houses. Some people greeted him, some only nodded. He did not explain. He did not retell the story. What needed proving had already been proven through choice, not speech. As the sun set, Michael returned home, turned on the lights, and cooked a simple dinner. He ate slowly without urgency. Every movement was intentional. He knew his life would no longer be dramatic, like the days that had passed, but it would be real, and real was what he had been missing for far too long. Before bed, Michael stood beneath the clock and watched the second hand move. He thought about the chair at the table years ago, about the moment he was pushed out of a place he believed was his. And finally, he smiled. Because he understood he had not lost his seat. He had been shown the way back to where he truly belonged. If this story reminds you of a moment when you stayed silent, even though you should have spoken, share your thoughts in the comments. If you have ever been underestimated simply because you were not loud press, so stories like this continue to be told. And if you want to walk with us through journeys where truth and dignity meet, do not forget to subscribe. Sometimes the final chapter is not the end, but the place where a real life truly begins.